Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to today's meeting. Some 2 years have passed since we last met at Manchester, and whereas there's been considerable upheaval in personnel, in all honesty, our government is little further advanced in the conundrum of how to secure the full benefits of Brexit. The British system of common law is highly flexible, whereas the EU system is entirely different and considerably more rigid. This lies at the heart of Britain's failure to secure post-Brexit arrangements that work for Britain. Furthermore, at the heart of the EU lies the dangerous fiction that there is no schism in sovereignty between the European Central Bank and central and member states. This distorts trade and enhances financial risk that is both opaque and unmanageable. Long-term membership of the European Union for any country poses risks for the prosperity and well-being of its citizens. I'm afraid that no political party in the short term is truly prepared to address these issues. Today, the Bruges Group poses the question, can the Tories win the next election? Since we left 2 years ago, here in Manchester, superficially, the landscape seems to have changed markedly. At our meeting then, we challenged the green commitments made by Boris Johnson at COP26. I posed the question, who is to blame? And a cry went up from the audience, to my surprise, of Carrie Antoinette. The next day, The Guardian attacked the Luddites represented by the Bruges Group, but that a visceral cry from our audience, I believe, was an early sign that the Boris Johnson administration was in deep trouble. Now, ladies and gentlemen, the decision by Rishi Sunak to delay unrealistic and expensive green targets is to be welcomed. Let's hope he goes further if re-elected. I must say that the efforts by Mr. Khan to tax off the roads those that can only afford older vehicles is quite despicable. For the last 10 years or so, a matter close to the hearts of Bruges Group members has been the folly of HS2. At last we have a Prime Minister who is fundamentally questioning the viability of this project. Its projected costs have risen from 30 billion to over 100 billion. And let's not forget that a 1p cut in the basic rate of tax costs only £3 billion. That just shows what a massive project this is. My advice to Mr. Sunak is to do what Bruges Group members have advocated all along and scrap the project lock, stock and barrel. I have set out my concerns about reaping the full benefits of Brexit, which I am sure many of you share. But although the government has failed to reap the full benefits, it only needs Keir Starmer to pop up with a shiny new immigration policy, which would hand back powers to the EU over immigration, to make one realise the importance of the next general election. Italian Prime Minister Meloni must be delighted to hear that Sir Keir would like to share and offer help with Italy's immigration scenario. Our first speaker today would have been the Vice Chairman of the Conservative Party, Lee Anderson, the Member of Parliament for the Ashfield constituency, where he was born and bred. Unfortunately, the Centre has decided to direct Lee elsewhere at very short notice this morning. I agree with you, sir. A great mistake, as I am sure Lee would have got a rapturous response from our audience here today. Lee turned a Labour majority of 8,820 votes into a Conservative majority of 5,733 votes. Lee was not on the Conservative Party A-list, but as far as I'm aware, his result was not bettered by any A-lister. Churchill said, trust the people. And that's what the Conservatives should do. Rather than pushing forward candidates the centre prefer. Yeah. Today, too many Conservative MPs are remote from our membership and too often reflect the opinions of the metropolitan elite. This weakens the appeal of the Conservative Party and introduces a tension within our party that should not exist. If the Conservative Party is to retain its coherence and MPs are to be respected as leaders, the centre must give more autonomy to associations to be free to choose the candidates of their choice. Now, our first speaker today will be Tim Congdon. Tim first came to my attention back in the 1970s when he worked on the Times newspaper under the editorship of William Rees-Mogg. Tim was a critic of the Heath government's monetary policies, which in due course caused inflation to spiral out of control. As a young accountant, I followed these developments closely, as I had done even as a schoolboy. In due course, Margaret Thatcher placed monetary economics at the heart of her policies. She also rejected fiscal laxity and firmly believed in a balanced budget over the cycle, even raising taxes during the 1981 recession. When she left office, government debt as a percentage of GDP had fallen to 23%. Today, it stands at 100% of GDP, back to the level last seen 60 years ago. 60 years ago, when we were still working off the debts accumulated in order to defeat Adolf Hitler. Thatcher rightly stated in her Bruges speech that we had rolled back the frontiers of the state. Regrettably, each of her 7 successors have expanded the frontiers of the state. An unprecedented period of low interest rates and central banks buying their own government debt appears to be coming to an end. I applaud the efforts of our Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, aimed at reducing the mountain of public sector debt that is stifling free enterprise. The makers of markets in debt, who are broadly people of a conservative frame of mind, seem to agree, and I welcome the article by our friend Jacob, son of William, in yesterday's Sunday Telegraph, where he states that unfunded tax cuts are not the answer, and stresses that we need to make an effort to balance the books.
Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great honour and pleasure to be talking in Bruges meeting again, and so thank you very much, Barry, for inviting me. I have prepared a presentation. It isn't really about next year's election, I have to confess. So, nevertheless, I hope you're interested. Now, this is the first picture. And in making this presentation, I thought I'd just go back to previous presentation of the Bruges Group. And this was the format of something I gave in March 2020 in London. And I just kept the flag and the Bruges Group sign. Now, I'm going to just slightly digress. This is what I said at that meeting. It's March 2020. By the way, trying to find out my views, I'm basically monetarist, Thatcherite, Eurosceptic. Those are the three things that all through my sort of 50-year career I've been involved with. In March 2020, early March last year, I was very worried about the way in which monetarism had declined, really. And I said that there's this risk of large deficits and inflation. If you don't play your own trumpet, nobody else will. So they were, I just see, I get some things right. Now, today I want to, I'm really concerned about the question of, will we remain on Brexit, will we rejoin the European Union? My basic answer is no. But I want to give you some ideas and some thoughts, because the arguments, the public debate goes on, and the better arguments we present, the more we'll make sure we retain our sovereignty and independence. I'm going to spend about maybe 7 or 8 minutes talking about Britain, Europe, and the world in the early 21st century. And then I'm going to come on to the 6 points I want to make, which I'm going to, when this crops up in your other debates you're taking part in, the 6 points you can always bring up to persuade why we must stay out of the European Union. Okay, now let's just go back to when we joined the then common market back in 1973, 1st of January 1973. It's very different world. And it's important to recognize that in the previous 20 or so years, our neighbours had enjoyed a lot of economic growth, a lot of success, and we thought that the case for joining this group, some people thought the case was very strong because of the success that they had economically. So the common market plus the UK was about over a quarter of world output, even higher as a share of world trade, and so now the first thing to say here is that this has changed. In the last 20, 30, 40 years, the EU has, the common market became the EU in 1993, and in the last 30 years since then, basically, the EU has been an economic failure. So the share of the EU world output is about 13–14%, and the rest of the world has had much faster growth than the European Union in that period. This is a chart which, this is the red line is the share of the EU in world output. You see it's falling sharply. And then there's this green line, which is CPTPP. It's also going down, I'm afraid, but that is this comprehensive and progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership. I hope they find some other phrase that's a bit of a mouthful at the moment. This is what the grouping that we joined in July last year, contains mostly members in the Pacific area, about half of whom are members of the Commonwealth. they have had somewhat faster economic growth in the last 20, 30 years than the EU. They do include Japan, and Japan has had stagnation really since the 1990s. At any rate, we've joined this bloc, and its share of world output is similar to that of the EU. And one of the, certainly with us joining it, it's, hang on, let's come back one. Its share of world output is about the same as that of the European Union. We haven't yet had, in the public debate, we haven't had much discussion of what we've done with this group. It contains, clear about it, contains Australia, Canada, New Zealand, Singapore, and as I said, half its members, roughly half its members are members of the Commonwealth. There is no plans to form a fiscal union, nothing ever post-union, nothing like that. This is a group of nations that have come together to trade more. That's it. In thinking about all these things, obviously the demographics is fundamental. And when we're looking ahead, say 25, 50 years, and we need to think in those terms, we're talking about a nation for our children, our grandchildren. It's very important to realize that the European Union share of world population is falling. If the trends that I showed you just a couple of slides ago were to continue, the European Union share of world output, when our grandchildren are in their prime, if you wish, in say 2075, will be about 7 or 8%. I hope that makes you think about the kind of world we're living in. And so it seems to me this reorientation towards the Pacific, towards the growing world, is a very sensible thing that we've done. The debate is utterly different than that of 1973. Right? Okay, so the opposition to Brexit from the Treasury, for example, was very much about how it would mean we had less prospects for trade in the future, and this would mean slow growth of trade, slow growth of productivity, lower living standards, and so on. I put it to you that that's going to turn out to be completely wrong. The European Union is going protectionist. We want to be open to the rest of the world in terms of our trade relations and our financial relations. Outside the EU, we can do that. We have made this commitment to the Trans-Pacific Group. And then, despite all that, we still do have a couple of problems. We still do have a free trade relationship with the EU. We are in a far better position than we were in 2014 or 2015 to grow our foreign trade in the 21st century. All right, critical point, we've made those choices already. When we have a debate about this subject in the next few years, under Labour or whatever, not Labour, but who knows, then these are the kind of things we must always highlight and emphasize. Okay, now for my 6 points. To some extent, the last point I've made is the most fundamental, because membership of the common market back in 73 was about trade and economics. I'm trying to get over to you that the debate today is in a very different context from that 50 or so years ago. We come on to my 6 points. I mean, suppose that you're Keir Starmer. Suppose you really do believe in UK membership of the European Union, and at some point he certainly did. I'm not sure what he really thinks nowadays, but he has in fact said that Labour doesn't intend to open negotiations about the EU. He has said that. What happens in detail, and I don't know, but that's what he said. Let's suppose that he was thinking about starting renegotiations. Point 1, cost. Do we recover the divorce bill of £39 billion? What is the entrance fee? There'd be an entrance fee because Britain remains relatively rich by European standards. It'd be a continuing membership cost. How much would you get back? What for? See, back in 73, there was an argument that we were joining this very successful bloc of nations. It's not like that now. Looking ahead 25, 50 years, their share of world output is 6, 7, 8%. So, I put it to you that Keir Starmer wouldn't want to negotiate about the cost of rejoining the European Union. There's then this question of the currency. I don't see how, given the fact that when the East European nations joined the European Union some years ago now, they were all required to adopt the single European currency at some point. They have to adopt it, but they were required to do so. That too would be a condition for us. We'd have to replace the pound with the euro. This shows you, it's a rather technical diagram, this shows you the relative debts of Germany. Germany is the big credit of the blue line. The debts of Italy and Spain are the red lines beneath it. You see it's basically the sort of scissors moving away from each other. There's tension within the European monetary union, within the single currency area. We wouldn't want to get involved. There'd be endless rows between us and the other major countries. If we did get involved, this is barely thinkable, frankly, at the moment. So that's the second point. This point here is, I think, hardly worth. It's obvious that Europe as a whole has an immigration problem. If we were to rejoin, we'd have to have discussions at the moment with Italians and other Mediterranean nations about what proportion of the asylum seekers we'd have to take, because there's negotiations at the moment between the Italians and the Germans and the French and all. So we wouldn't have control of our borders. I know that high net immigration last year and this year, but we don't want that. There's then this question of the domestic labour market. Remember in the House, the whole of the runners have joined the European Union labour market. There's also Ukraine, as and when their gas war is over. So that's also something to bear in mind. I want now, coming towards the end of my presentation, if that's okay, Barry?
That's fine, too.
We need to think quite hard about who we are, what a nation is. A nation, of course, defends itself, so it has an army, a navy, and an air force. And let's just be clear what's going on in the European context. The European Union, all the other states, we're out now mostly, but the member states have made a commitment to common defence forces, common defence procurement, and common foreign policy, etc. What does that mean over the next 10, 20, 30 years for the continued existence of the British Army, the Royal Navy, the Royal Air Force, if we rejoin? Imagine asking that question of Keir Starmer at a public meeting. What do you intend to do about the Royal Navy and the Royal Air Force to have continued existence if we rejoin the European Union? This is not secret, by the way, it's perfectly open about what's going on. We have these questions about our ultimate loyalties and identity. As Barry said, we are a nation which has a distinctive legal tradition, common law jurisdiction, very different from the European traditions. They vary between the different countries, but again, there's this attempt to harmonize legal systems on a very different basis from common law. So, what would happen for a family? And then I want to get to a really critical question, which is about intelligence services and to whom their loyalty really lies. I thought I'd do a bit of research on this, and I found this quote. It's very difficult to do, by the way. But, since 2015, there's been, we can't read this, there's been increased security cooperation between European Union member states, rest at accelerated pace. The Union's foreign security and defence policies prospect increased cooperation and enhanced arms cooperation, creating an international capacity to act. European Security Union. And now, ladies and gentlemen, listen to this, it's in red. In the shadow of these developments is the question of the extent to which European intelligence cooperation could also be promoted in this particularly sensitive area. No steps towards integration that will attract public attention are to be expected. My word. So basically, they're going to get rid of the Royal Navy and the Air Force and the rest of it, and not tell us about it. That would be what would happen if you were inside the European Union. This is the so-called money method. It's all done between experts in committees behind closed doors. So where was this from? That's where it's from. This is a German think tank. By the way, I've spoken at German think tank meetings. They're nice people. You know, I have German friends. They have a different history from us, all right? Different identity, different loyalty. And this was actually a dictum which it's subsidized by the German state. Okay, so some of the 6 points. There's the 6 points I just given you. I hope that you can. If these ideas crop up at some point in there's the cost, there's the trade relations, there's the we don't control our borders anymore, there's a common labour market, we give up our military capacity to an EU control, and we give up foreign policy to rather, well, no longer really the king, or it's actually some EU functionary, I suppose. So, let's just be clear. I want us to be friends with our neighbours. I enjoy travelling to Europe. I enjoy visiting Europe. I invest in European companies. Fine. By the way, I enjoy travelling to Australia and Canada and investing in Australian and Canadian companies. They're not special. The fact they're close to us doesn't make them special. You don't have to unify, you don't have to political union with them, for heaven's sake. So, ultimately we want to govern ourselves. And so I hope today, ladies and gentlemen, I've given you some arguments to present to public debates in the next 2 years if there's any suggestion about rejoining the European Union. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tim. Our next speaker today is Lord Hannan of Kingsclere. But to me, he will always quite simply be Dan. I know exactly when I first came into contact with Dan. It was November 1992, some 31 years ago. I had, as a brand new member of Parliament, decided to vote against the Maastricht Treaty. The treaty provided for the abolition of national currencies, including the pound, and their replacement by the euro. Many Conservative MPs told me this was unacceptable, but when it came to the vote, only 23 of us were prepared to go into the no lobby. However, this vote, I believe, was a watershed in Conservative perceptions of the European Union. As I say, I suddenly found I had a lot of enemies, from the Prime Minister, John Major, down. In due course, a few friends emerged, such as the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Norman Lamont, who, although holding the second highest office in the government, actually shared my analysis completely. Margaret Thatcher also thoroughly endorsed my decision. As this hullabaloo raged in November 1992, there was a surprise development when flowers arrived at my home for my wife from a young student at Oxford University called Dan. My wife sometimes asks me, whatever happened to Dan? Well, he's here today, and he has had a most distinguished career as a member of the European Parliament, a member of the House of Lords, and one of the most outstanding journalists whose skills of advocacy are regularly available to those of us who read the Telegraph Group newspapers. Ladies and gentlemen, could you please give the warmest of welcomes to a great Conservative, Dan Hannan.
Thank you for those very generous words. And ladies and gentlemen, it's wonderful to be back. I took my first faltering steps in politics as a member of the Bruges Group. I think I joined this organisation in 1990 when it was new. Patrick Robertson was the secretary, Lord Harris of High Cross was the chairman, and Euroscepticism wasn't really a thing yet. The Bruges Group was, if you like, the beginning of what became the movement that led to what we now call Brexit, although nobody was to invent that word for another couple of decades. I do indeed remember I was, as an undergraduate, I set up the Oxford campaign for an independent Britain, and I remember reading, when the Maastricht Treaty vote happened, that there were only 4 of the new intake MPs who'd been brave enough to vote against. And I read this story about how the Whips were all being very rude and bullying towards them, and even, and at the age of 18, even this struck me as unfair, even phoning their wives and saying, you know, they've made a terrible mistake. Can you talk? I thought this was so outrageous, so we did a whip round. And we indeed sent flowers to Mrs. Barry Legg and the other 3, who in memory served were Mrs. Walter Sweeney, Mrs. Ian Duncan Smith, and Mrs. Bernard Jenkins, I think, before 92 intake who voted against. But, you know, it's a really striking thing to look at how the argument has evolved since then. Bruges Group took its inspiration from Margaret Thatcher's Bruges speech, which is almost exactly 35 years old. So, late September of 1988. And the striking thing when you look at her speech at the College of Europe is how almost banal it is in its very gentle and constructive criticisms of extreme federalism. It's difficult to imagine why anyone would now react to it in the way that the leaders of the EU did in those days, which was explosive, as though expunging some terrible heresy. And it's worth just thinking about this. People say, you know, what was it? I was always being asked in Brussels, what is it you've got against the EU? When did you change your minds about it? Why did you go from voting 2-1 to stay in 1975? And I'd say, well, look, there's more to it than just one thing, but if you want the single biggest reason, it was the Maastricht Treaty. Up until that moment, you could still plausibly claim that the European Economic Community, as it still was until 1992, was primarily about trade and economics. It was a club of countries getting together to do what they couldn't achieve singly, to collaborate and magnify their collective power. But after Maastricht, it was very clear that we were on a road towards political union. Maastricht extended the jurisdiction of the EU, as it became in the Maastricht Treaty, into fields that had nothing conceivably to do with policy. It became orthodoxy. And I think from then on, it was, for Britain, a question of could we opt out of it, or would we have to leave the whole European Union? For what it's worth, I suspect that even as late as February 2016, if David Cameron had come back with any significant retrieval of power, had it been in just one area, had he come back with a repatriation of power in, let's say, fisheries or industrial policy or whatever, that would have been enough, because he'd have established the precedent that power didn't always get sucked into the centre, that it could move up or down. Who can doubt in that situation that Britain would have stayed in the European Union? And I mention this only because it's something that is almost never raised. When I speak to friends, we must all have friends who voted Remain and who regret it. When I speak to them, one of the things that they never seem to do is interrogate the EU's role, either before or after the referendum. I'm struck again and again by the way in which the Remain and Rejoin movement is strikingly uninterested in what's happening in the EU. He seems to be much more motivated by dislike of Euroscepticism than by any real loyalty to Brussels. Certainly, this was replicated in the EU itself. So you remember how we kept on deferring Brexit? It was pretty awkward for me as a still MEP. And if you've ever had that experience where you say goodbye to somebody in a really long, involved way, and then you find that you're both walking in exactly the same direction. That was my life for years after the Brexit vote, because we kept on setting a date for Brexit, and I, make sure that my wonderful Spanish staffers had jobs to go on to in Brussels, and I'd say goodbye to everyone, would have a farewell dinner, and then with some crashing Maypos, I find myself creeping back the next week. And this happened 4 times, I think, that the Brexit date was postponed. Even my German colleagues, who are not usually the first to see the funny side, even they were beginning to display a little twitch around their lips. But anyway, that taught me a lot about how the EU saw Brexit, because I was still there for fully 4 years afterwards. And listening to the comments of my friends and colleagues, I thought that there were basically, almost all of them, there were 3, if you like, acceptable responses to the Brexit. One was disbelief. You're never actually going to leave. Denial, whatever you want to call it. One was rage. Working class oafs led astray by unscrupulous demagogues and foreign newspaper owners. And one was a kind of vindictive contempt. Yeah, okay, leave and then see what happens. Right? The one thing that was absolutely unacceptable, one thing I never heard from anyone was, I wonder why they voted leave. I wonder whether we might have played that victim. I wonder whether anyone else might vote leave if they were given a referendum in another country. The EU missed its great opportunity to interrogate its own policies, to ask whether there was a problem with the remoteness of its policy, the attitudes of its officials, and the speed with which it had been agglomerating power. Instead, as we just heard from Professor Congdon, it's pushed ahead with more integration, especially in the fields of taxation and military capacity. So, Brexit, it seems to me, if we ask this, if you put it like this, why was the EU not prepared to make any concession to David Cameron? Why was it not prepared to allow any power to be devolved? Why was it readier to lose its second largest member than to allow the precedent that some powers might be devolved? Well, the answer is because for the people running the EU, devolving power, ending the one-way street, reversing the ratchet, would have been the worst possible outcome, right? And that, in the end, I think, is what made Brexit inescapable. And so thank you to everyone involved in this organisation for having the courage to stand out against all of the official prognostications of doom, which, I have to say, have spectacularly failed to materialise. And it is worth taking a moment, because a casual reader of our headlines, and particularly a casual reader of the headlines of some European and American media, would think that our economy has been an absolute disaster and that Brexit has failed on every level. Actually, what we were told, not just by the Remain campaign, which is fair enough, but by the Treasury and the Bank of England and the IMF and the OECD, all of the predictions we were given for an immediate recession, rise in unemployment, collapse in house prices, fall of the stock exchange, all of those things turned out to be the opposite. I can spend the rest of today's session just talking about economic data, but let me just give you the bottom line. Whether you count from the referendum, or whether you count from the date on which Brexit took effect, Britain has grown faster than the EU. That seems to me an open and shut case against the catastrophism that so many still think was experienced. Right? The disaster that so many still insist, in fact, took place. Now, I can't prove that if we'd stayed in the EU, we wouldn't have grown even faster. Of course, no one can prove a negative. It's a counterfactual. But I think that was not the claim. The claim was that by voting we were condemning ourselves to some kind of civilizational collapse. Well, we have grown faster than France and Germany and Spain, and so on. That is not to say that we've made all the decisions that have come since once. EU lifted constraints, allowed us to make, Brexit removed constraints, allowed us to make different decisions. I think we have failed to take advantage of some of the opportunities that have opened up. But I think it is fundamentally dishonest to have this deliberate conflation that we've had from so many pundits of Brexit and the cost of the lockdown. One of those cosmic coincidences was that the day that Brexit took effect, January 2020, was the first day that 2 coronavirus victims were found in York. And those two things have been mischievously and deliberately conflated ever since. Yes, we are much poorer as a result of telling people to stay home for 2 years, for the better part of 2 years. How could we not be? So is almost every other country in the world. But if you wanted to argue that Brexit had made us poorer on top of that, you'd need to show that we had fared worse than other countries in a comparable situation. Now, actually, until a few weeks ago, it did slightly look on some data as though you could have made that claim, at least sustained it in some cases, but the ONS's spectacular revision of our GDP figures for 2020 have made that a nonsense. And by the way, there is something rather delicious, because if you're one of those Remainers who spent the last 2 years saying the only reason that we have fallen in GDP is because of Brexit, then presumably, by your own logic, now that the figures have been upgraded, if that really was the only factor, then by your own logic, Brexit must have been a success. Right? There could be no other explanation for our having outperformed Germany or France and so on. Anyway, you did the right thing, but I do want to talk about what's actually on the on the flyers, because can the Conservatives win? That question again cannot be divorced from what we went through in response to the pandemic. If you pay people to stay home for the better part of 2 years, and you print money to cover the difference, you're not just going to be a lot poorer as a country. You're not just going to lose, as we did, the better part of £500 billion. You're going to change attitudes. Some people are going to become habituated to happiness. The culture of the country will be different coming out of it. The pandemic on its own was bound to make people a little bit more introverted, a little bit more wary, a little bit more authoritarian. This is what all collective threats or perceived collective threats do. It's a phenomenon well observed by behavioral psychologists. When you have a natural disaster of any kind, earthquake, plague, volcano eruption, people become more demanding of the smack and firm government and more intolerant of any kind of dissent. And the reality of COVID and the lockdown was no different. If you look at the change in attitudes between 2019 and now on questions like should the government set prices? Should the government fix rates? Should we nationalise rail, water, whatever? You see a huge swing in a statist direction, which I think, looking at the timeline, could only be a response to the lockdown, to people being habituated for all those months to having to ask permission before they could travel, use their own toilets. We've become, in common with other countries, a much more statist people than we were. Only precedent I can think of that is comparable is what happened after 1940, when, again, the experience of mobilization and conscription created a demand for government which meant that the powers seized by the state on a supposedly contingent basis in 1940 were not returned after 1945. We carried on with rationing and conscription, and indeed, we carried on with the economic settlement brought in on a supposedly emergency basis to beat Hitler up until the Thatcher reforms, exchange controls and so on. So I'm afraid that when we're looking at the question, can Conservatives win? Any free marketeer in any democracy is struggling against a statist movement, a leftist cultural moment occasioned by the experience that we went through. Now, within those constraints, I think that we are actually, we're doing a lot better. If we had this meeting a couple of weeks ago, I would have been struggling to point to any signs of optimism. But as Barry said in his introduction, a number of things are now palpably improving. And I just want to run through what a couple of them are, starting with the ones that Barry mentioned. So, it was extraordinary that we were proposing to push ahead with more or less arbitrary green targets, plucked out of the air, in a way that was designed to send us in, rather than based on any proportionate cost-benefit analysis of what was afforded. We learned in very conservative autocrats to want to pursue climate change policies in a way that is proportionate and affordable, rather than in the millenarian Thunbergite spirit that if you deviate in any jot or tittle from our arbitrary targets, you're burning the world. Right? I think Rishi Sunak has got that exactly right. On HS2, look, the moment, let's be honest about this, the moment at which we could have got a decent amount of money back by cancelling the whole thing, passed, the last moment passed under Boris Johnson. We're now locked in to a number of contracts, which means that we're going to spend the same amount whether or not we get the railway. We can't get back any significant sums of money from the main part of the line. By the way, it's an almost perfect example of how political cowardice distorts wise policy. It was obvious 10 years ago that this project was going massively over budget. It was, in fact, obvious at least by 2012. A project that had been sold as 15 million was already then going to be 100 billion. Every time it came up for review, in retrospect, the correct thing would be for the Minister of the day to say, you know what, let's cut our losses. Every time it came up for review, the relevant minister took the politically expedient decision, the more cowardly decision of saying, let's throw good money after bad, rather than risk precisely the headlines that Rishi Sunak is now attracting in some parts of the country who think they're not going to be voted up to the line. Now, look, don't get me wrong, if there was some way of getting this train by waving a magic wand for nothing, I would do it, right? I know I can see my friends the Straffels over there who live quite close to where the line is going to be. I know that there are some people who didn't want it at all, for any price because it was going to ruin the country. That is not my position. My position was purely based on the cost of the thing. And at least we've now got a government trying to restore some basic conservative housekeeping principles. Restore some order and sanity to our public finances by trimming the bits where we can still realistically get some money back. It's not ideal, but given the hand that he had to play, it's the best I think Rishi Sunak could have done. We've got the announcement today about cracking down on the massive expansion of working age people who are on some kind of sickness or incapacity benefits. So again, always very politically dangerous to do this. Never popular. It always looks like the rich attacking the poor. But something has gone badly wrong when the number of people of working age not working has risen to 5.4 million, up by nearly 2 million in the last 5 years, at a time when we are still importing hundreds of thousands of eager workers who are walking straight into jobs. and when we have massive labour shortages across the country. Fraser Nelson, one writer who's been really properly pursuing this story, recently wrote about how in this city, 18% of people in Manchester are out of working age people are out of work when there are 40,000 job vacancies in Manchester, some of them extremely well paid. So again, something has gone badly wrong. Now, it may be, I'm not saying that everyone on one of these benefits is work shy. I think there is genuinely a rise in some mental health conditions, triggered not by COVID, but by lockdown. What we're seeing is not long COVID, but long lockdown. If you tell people for 2 years, do not set foot outside your house because there's a terrible, frightening virus out there, you are bound to increase the number of people who have depression and anxiety. But for most people suffering from those conditions, the best thing that can happen is that they get back into the workplace, socialised, with purpose, working with other people. And so, again, there'll be sob stories on the BBC, and I'm sure Holly Toynbee will write pieces about hard cases and so on, but it is a moral as well as an economic necessity to ensure that people have those productive lives. What else have we been doing? We're talking finally about the possibility of tax cuts. And by the way, this has to happen before the election. I don't think anyone's going to take anything on trust anymore. But I am very encouraged by the readiness to make, if you like, unpopular tax cuts, or at least tax cuts that are not the obvious populist ones, if that is the way to stimulate growth. So the conversation has been about whether we trim or remove completely the inheritance tax on. Again, the case against that, in terms of perception, writes itself. Only 4% of the estates are affected, the Tories are helping the rich again. And yet I can't help looking around the world. Expert on monetary policy will back me up on this, I'm sure. I can't help looking around the world and seeing that the countries that have abolished taxes on savings and inheritance are the ones that have grown fastest. The Singapores, the Australias, and the Indians. Because not only does it mean greater growth in the long term, it very often means greater prosperity in the short term. If you are a plutocrat and you are at the moment taking expensive short-term steps with expensive accountants to not pay the same inheritance, you're also incidentally not paying a bunch of other taxes. Take away the fear of the inheritance tax liability, and a lot of those people would not pay the high upfront fees for the expensive accountants, and would then end up paying lots of taxes in other regards. It's a really basic principle that everyone seems to have forgotten, that if you do it in a wise and judicious way, you can cut tax rates and increase tax revenues. Put all of these things together, and I think you can discern a conservative approach. By the way, we also, I think, should give this government rather more credit than it's getting for not caving into these unreasonable public sector pay demands. Not least from the railmen, who hugely inconvenienced me, and I suspect a lot of you, by doing what they always do, which is to target their strikes around the Conservative Party conference. So, Rishi Sunak inherited this position of having to subsidise people's fuel bills, but he has not extended it to subsidising people's mortgages. Now, all of this, you might say, well, it's too little, too late, it's only a scratch, but listen to the tone of the public debate. There is an almost universal demand for more government intervention in everything. To have done what it is doing, which is to make some savings and to keep the high ground of being moderate and sensible in doing it, make the other side sound like the extremists, that is no small achievement. So, just frankly, I suppose, I suspect a lot of you in this audience are sceptical of this. Just ask the question, why is he getting so little credit for the good things he's done on reducing regulation, reducing taxes, or going easier on some of these green targets? It's a really odd thing, isn't it? I mean, on almost any measure, Rishi Sunak is a more conventional Conservative than Boris was. Certainly on public spending, the issue that fundamentally drove him to resign as Chancellor. He was fed up with signing all the checks for unwarranted spending increases. On immigration, Boris used to boast about how he'd given proposed an amnesty when he was mayor of London. Rishi was always more hardline. Obviously on these green issues. Why does he get so little credit from people who you think would agree with those things? It's an interesting question, and the only answer I've been able to come up with is that we live in an age when the vibes trump the policy. I was very struck by this during the leadership contest last summer between Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak. I voted for Boris as leader in the first place. I didn't think he should have resigned. I believed he had a largeness of character and a generosity of soul that would appeal to the electorate, and I don't resile from that. But I never thought for a moment that the guy was any kind of fiscal conservative. He boasted about being a Brexit hesitant, and he meant it. When it then came to Liz versus Rishi, there was curiosities that I reckon 80% of the leavers among our party members voted for the candidate who had backed Remain. And about 80% of the Remainers voted for the candidate who had backed Leave. And by the way, had backed Leave consistently. Rishi wasn't wavering until the last minute in the way that Boris was. He'd been writing Eurosceptic articles when he was still at school. So why does he struggle to convey that side of his personality to the people who you'd think would be the most attuned to hear it? And I think it just comes down to looks and impressions, to what we old Brussels hands like pretentiously call gestalt. It's the way it's the taste of the guy. In very blunt terms, during that summer contest, Liz Truss looked and sounded like a Eurosceptic. You know, she said blunt things in a provincial accent and annoyed all the right people. Whereas Rishi looked and sounded like the CEO of a big multinational with his hair, his thin ties and his tight suits and so on. It's amazing how people make their tribal identifications on the basis of these quite superficial indicators and then reverse engineer the politics and convince themselves that their candidate really agrees with them. So actually, if you look at the black and white of the policy, it is really very difficult to portray Rishi Sunak in the way that he almost always is at meetings like this as some kind of, conservative in name only, some sort of anti-waste Lib Dem Davos man. He has been the first candidate, the first Prime Minister since the Brexit vote, actually to try and rein back the growth of the state. Admittedly, as I say, he's swimming against the current culturally. But by heaven, how nice to see someone at least having a go, at least trying to restore order and sanity to our public finances. Can the Conservatives win? Look, a fifth term is a big ask. It's never happened before. It last happened between 1807 and 1830. It's never happened in a democratic age. It was 5 successive general elections. So it is a big ask. It is a big ask. But I would just urge you, and I want to leave a bit of time for questions, I would just urge you to think of this. Saying, all a bunch of shysters, I'm going to sit home, can't be any worse. You really think it can't be any worse? Use your imagination a little bit. All of the problems that we have, excessive spending, excessive taxation, excessive borrowing, are going to be exacerbated under a Labour government. That isn't speculation, that's them talking about what they want to do. The culture wars are going to have the full backing of government. It won't be rogue civil servants signing up to Stonewall to the horror of their ministers. This will be the entire establishment of politicians, officials, academics, charity heads, all pushing their identity politics at huge public expense. But I just want to leave you with this thought that it's tempting to say to ourselves, well, how much damage could Starmer do in one term? He'd take over, and then he'd have the same constraints on economic policy that any government would have. We're still spending way more than we're raising in taxes. There'll be some kind of sterling crisis. He'll be swept away, and then we can come back in a different form. Don't underestimate the fundamental wiliness of Labour when it comes to rigging the rules to make sure that they spend. And I think there are two particular things that they are speaking about quite openly, one of which they've now adopted formally as their policy. First, to give the vote to 16-year-olds. Now, the blatancy of that move is just so shocking that it leaves critics not knowing where to start. Labour, both when they were in office and now in opposition, have backed the raising of the age of consent to 18 for everything. For everything. Right? You now have to be 18 rather than 16 to get a tattoo, to get a mortgage, to buy a bottle of wine, to buy a knife, to get Botox treatment, and yet to buy cigarettes, and yet Labour is seriously saying 16-year-olds whom we have prevented by law from doing all of those things are mature enough to decide whether anyone else should get to do them. There is something just so flagrant about that. It's straightforward gerrymandering. And then the other thing, which is in a way even more outrageous, is this idea of giving the vote to EU nationals. Why? First of all, why? What is the difference in our law now between a Portuguese national and a Panamanian national? They're not in the EU. What is special about the EU? EU countries do not give each other's nationals the vote in general elections. So we'd be doing something that we didn't do as a member and that other members do not do vis-à-vis each other. Again, why? Because there is a calculation that resentment of Brexit would bring in another couple of million voters to the Labour Party, and I suspect that they're doing that because they thought it through and they've done the polling. So please do not make the mistake of thinking, well, we can afford to sit it out and we'll be back, possibly with a different set of policies, different set of personnel or whatever. That isn't how politics work. If there's one thing I've really learned in the time that I've been involved is that there is such a thing as trying to be too clever in politics. So, ladies and gentlemen, as I say, I'd like to leave a bit of time for discussion, but I do think that if this group, after all its successes, having stood out against all the bullying and all the lies and all the pressure from every party, every business, every international leader, having secured Brexit, if we now take our foot off the pedal and say, well, it doesn't much matter, job done, it doesn't matter who now takes over, then, in truth, all of the opportunities will be squandered. We have a leader of the opposition who quite frankly says we're going to sign up to as many of these policies from the outside as we can. It seems to me a bizarre situation where you say we'd stay outside the whole thing, but we would then unilaterally shadow and copy all of the policies. That really is a position that nobody would have in the first place. Let's try to stop that from happening. Let's keep alive the possibility of this country raising its eyes to more distant horizons and seizing the immense opportunities that are out there.
Well, I've heard quite a lot of speeches as chairman of the Bruges group. And I think what we've just heard from Dan is one of the most eloquent and rational speeches I've ever had the privilege to hear. I would just like to give one small insight into the Westminster system. Dan said, he named a number of Conservative MPs who voted against Maastricht. Every one of those Conservative MPs that he named actually were going to vote against Maastricht at 11 o'clock on the morning of the vote. The leader of the Maastricht group, Michael Spicer, said to me after a meeting we had, in which 40 Conservative MPs said they were going to vote against Maastricht. He said, people will come under immense pressure today. And just make sure of one thing, that you and Ian are in that no longer at 10 o'clock. In fact, it was just Ian and I. Other MPs that were mentioned all came under immense pressure and decided to abstain. And that's how the Westminster system regrettably works. But fortunately, Ian and I stood firm And that was the beginning of the end for the Europhiles. That vote led in time to us leaving the EU. And we must never, never, never abandon that legacy. Our tour de force, the floor is now open to you to put your questions, ladies and gentlemen. Yes, you sir. Yes sir. Try and be brief.
Cheers, yeah. It's Joseph Robertson from the Epoch Times. Two-part question. So Labour's listening to its members is something it does rather well, other things aside. Does the panel think that fresh groups like the New Conservatives and potentially the CDO could provide a route for members' voices to be in the manifesto at the general election? And do you have any thoughts on Lord Cruddas' calls last night for Tory donors to cease funding the party until it listens to its members? How can the Prime Minister reconnect with the grassroots and intervene in that kind of rhetoric?
Good question.
Okay. I think you're probably well equipped to do that.
Well, I'm certainly not in favour. I'm in favour of everyone giving whatever they can if they believe that the Conservative Party will be better than the other lot. You know, I no difficulty disagreeing with my friend Peter Cruddas on that. Look, the real problem here is that we have a much dwindled base of members. We don't have anything like the mass organisation that we had a couple of decades ago. In fact, so when I was first selected as an MEP candidate in the late 90s, I think we had 125,000 members in the southeast. I'm not sure we have 125,000 members nationally now. And so the real challenge for us is how do we expand that base? Now, part of it, as I think you were implying, is to make it more inclusive offer for members. And I would like to involve members more in policy making. Sitting immediately behind you is the man who had the one member, one vote campaign all the way through the 90s and 2000s, which ended up producing something, correct me if I'm wrong about this, John, but producing something which you've never asked for, which is member votes in leadership elections. What I remember that your campaign was for was control over the Treasury, CCHQ and policy making. And I would very much like to see a much bigger role for members in shaping policy. I just got back from the Canadian Party Conference, Canadian Conservative Party Conference a couple of weeks ago in Quebec City. That is still a policy, it happens every 2 years, and it is still a policy-making convention. And the result of that is that they have a larger and younger membership because people get involved with a specific aim of shaping policy. So I would like to see us do that. Peter's point about, you know, was the leadership campaign stolen? I mean, I was always against having this system for precisely the reason that we can now see. It's completely unstable that you can be elected as leader by the party membership without the support of your MPs. And we need to find ways of fixing that. It happened to Ian Ludwig-Smith. It then effectively happened again, would have happened again to Boris, and then again to Liz Truss. It's not a stable way of running a party. And I would like, after the next election, I'd like the 1922 committee and the party board to sit down and say, we will work from scratch on a new system of choosing our leaders. The last one was put together on the back of an envelope in 1997 in weeks by William Hague, who is now disowned. But to make sure that nobody tries to game it and say what rules would favour my particular candidate, we should build in a delay and say these rules will only take effect 5 years from now or 2 contests from now or whatever, so that people can then properly think about what is in the interest of the party as a whole.
Yes, sir. Yes, yes.
Is the problem less Rishi Sunak and simply the Conservative Party? We've talked about this in terms of democracy, but the last 13 years they did nothing to roll back the Blair reforms, which I believe are causing all sorts of issues governing now. You know, they've dusted down the note that was handed to them and giving it to Labour, which says there's no money left. And I just think that to win this election, we really need to get on the front foot with policy open goals, which I think are not being achieved because of the factions within the party. So, climate, culture, Brexit, what's called in the net because of the factions within the party. So I think it's the party that less than.
It's definitely the case that we should have undone some of the structural changes that Blair left in place, the Equality Act being a supreme example. But, actually, a bunch of things that the civil service now feel empowered to do in defiance of the express wishes of their elected ministers. And whether that would have happened without COVID, we'll never know. There was a moment when Boris and Dominic Cummings were talking about these overhauls. We'll never know if that would have happened. On the money, I think it is only fair to give credit where it's due. At the end of the Thatcher era, the state was taking about 35%, just under 35% of the national GDP. And that carried on for a bit. You remember Blair said we'll respect the Tory budgets for the first 2 or 3 years, and so that remained low, and then it started shooting up. And by the time Gordon Brown left office, that figure had gone from 35% to 46%. Now, it's not quite true to say that the Conservatives then did nothing. Over the next 10 years, that figure fell from 46% to 40%. Under the coalition, then under David Cameron. And then up until the lockdown. In 2020, it was at 40%, next year it will be 47%. What we're really seeing is the impact of the lockdown. The impact of not just the money that we spend. Okay, we're no longer spending money on furlough or grants to business. But there is an almost universal determination to dig in and defend the other spending, which was brought in on an emergency basis in 2020, as though it was some immemorial part of the Constitution. There's this universal assumption almost that spending shot up to deal with the pandemic. Now it cannot fall back to the level of January 2020. Taxes have to go up to meet it. And this is particularly true of the two biggest increases we've had, which is healthcare and social security. Now, I'm afraid any politician who says we can cut spending without being prepared to cut healthcare and social security is not serious about cutting spending. But equally, any politician who is honest about that is probably not going to win. And that's the dilemma we're in, right? That the public, as I say, is in a statist mood. And by the way, let's remember that, 94% of people backed the first lockdown, 86% backed the second lockdown, 74% didn't want the restrictions lifted when Boris finally lifted them. By the way, mainly it was Rishi Sunak's pushing. All of that. Now, there'll be people in this room who were within that majority, there'll be people who were in the minority. There will also, statistically, be some of you who were in favour of the lockdown at the time and have now forgotten it. Because this is what psychologists call hindsight bias. We really struggle to imagine that we ever held a different opinion from the one that we currently have. But I'm afraid that the figures were pretty clear and backed up by a massive polling. So in that situation, the reason we are in this mess financially, like Alan Partridge, I blame the general public. People were not interested in the long-term fiscal consequences of demanding every kind of lockdown, every kind of restriction. However you phrase the question, closing shops, closing borders, closing bars, you've always got a massive majority of people clamouring for it. That, fundamentally, is why we're in the mess.
Tim, what insights have you on this topic?
Okay, well, I'm going to indulge in nostalgia. I knew Maggie Thatcher a bit, and I went to some of her Christmas parties. Sometimes I spoke to her what I thought, and I remember telling her once that the Conservatives won the election in 1951, 1970 and 1979 on a programme of freedom, and she loved that. Look, we need some rhetoric, some passion, all the rest of it, and well, let's hope so. Daniel, look, I'm sorry, things have gone horribly wrong. In the early 1990s in Britain, let's just give you like an example, I may shock some people as well, I'm not sure. We'd solved the problem of pensions. We had a system in which it was going to get meaner and meaner and meaner as the decades went by. Because essentially, the basic state pension was linked to prices and only prices. So as a share of GDP, the demographics having a problem, the capital is falling. And there were very substantial subsidies, private pensions. We had, along the Netherlands, the strongest private pension industry in the world. The private pension sector has been hit by an avalanche of regulations, tax changes and so on, and is now in retreat. And we have triple lock, which will certainly, indefinitely, increase the ratio of pensions paying to GDP. Indefinitely. Do I hear anything? I mean, I am a member of the Conservative Party, I will vote Conservative next year. My view about the Conservative Party in the last 20 years is extremely mixed. Will anybody in your party, in our party, will they say what's happened to pension policy is utterly wrong and we should end the triple lock straight away? Can I just say, yes, I know very well, I'm in my 70s, I know very well the triple lock is supposed to go help the elderly voter. There are many elderly voters who want a Britain that's good for their children and grandchildren and don't want a country that's ruined by high public spending and high welfare spending. So no, that's the right thing to do, and it's very much, may I just say this, it's very much the Conservative Party's fault for the change in public pension policy in the last 30 years.
Do you think, I mean, serious question, do you think Keir Starmer might end the triple lock or allow the state pension?
I don't know. I don't know. You know, I really just don't know. But can I just say that, you know, as I knew Thatcher, I knew the ministers in that period, and I haven't really learned a lot in the present Conservative government. They don't really interest me, and they don't interest in me either. So, you know, I just sort of, we just have to weep.
Thanks, Tim. Yes, sir.
Hello, I'm Paul from Manchester. It's a question, will Keir Starmer and Ms Kevin Keegan blow a 10-point lead?
Say that again.
Will Keir Starmer and Ms Kevin Keegan blow a 10-point lead?
Can I just, I gather from various people that Keir Starmer is absolutely hopeless at spontaneous interviews. And I'm upset people in this room. Theresa May almost lost the 2017 election because I'm afraid she wasn't much crop, frankly. I'm sorry if that upset me. Look, that is quite possible that he'll lose 5-10% of it, because I gather he's hopeless at the spontaneous interviews.
It's possible. No one foresaw the total collapse of the SNP overnight, and anything can happen. And therefore, being behind in the polls should not lead you to give up in despair. You have to hold yourself in readiness to exploit any mistake or any slip by the other side. Even if, and we can all reach opinion polls, we all know that this is a big ask. But just, in Scotland we were not in a position to exploit it because we'd basically given up. Let's not repeat that mistake in the UK as well.
Unfortunately, we're running up against time, and I know our speakers have other commitments, so I'm just going to take 2 more questions. I'll take one from the lady at the front. Could you please speak loudly so that we can hear your question?
I will try, thank you. As a former Conservative Special Advisor and someone, as you can hear, comes from Northern Ireland, I would like to ask the panel, do the benefits of our exit from the European Union, which I strongly support, do they extend to the people of Northern Ireland who now find themselves receiving mail from the rest of the UK with customs stickers, a barrier east-west, and the animation of the United Ireland proponents, including the Taoiseach this week, Leo Varadkar? We feel that we have not received those benefits and that we're in a much worse position.
All right. I think we'll be on. So, well, the answer obviously is no. The benefits have not extended to Northern Ireland, but it's important to understand why this ridiculous situation came about. As I mentioned, I was still in Brussels when all of this was, after the vote. No one had suggested anything as absurd as an internal frontier in the UK. until after the 2017 general election. So for the first year after the referendum, all the talk in Brussels was about finding technical solutions in the way that the previous Taoiseach in Ireland was quite open about it. Right? What changed? What changed was that in 2017, an anti-Brexit majority took over the House of Commons and said in terms, we will not allow Brexit to happen, except in a way that Brussels is happy. That wasn't the words they used. They said we won't allow a no-deal Brexit. In fact, it's exactly the same, isn't it? That means exactly the same thing. So, and then they didn't just say that, they passed a law to enforce it, the Ben or the Let Me Ben legislation. What did we expect that Brussels was going to do in response to that? When you're told, well, Britain will not leave except on terms that you like. Of course they started advancing the most outrageous demands, of which the most outrageous was that part of the UK should remain partially under their own jurisdiction. Now, I think that situation was slightly ameliorated by Boris, and has been further slightly ameliorated by Rishi. But the fundamental problem remains that Northern Ireland is being treated, at least for purposes of goods regulation, as part of the European Union. And I don't think that is a sustainable long-term solution.
Final question, gentleman there. Yes, you sir. Yes, you sir.
Hi, Nick Simon from Nottingham. Would it be good advice to Rishi Sunak to say, leave the ECHR or leave number 10?
But I think he's well aware of the stakes, and I think he's given it to be understood that if the ECHR intervenes in a way that prevents our immigration reforms from being enacted, then it is better to leave, or at least leave bits of it, than to give up control of our borders. I have to say, it was nothing to do with us. It's very difficult to look at the pronouncements of these judges without concluding that they were looking for a way of overturning it. So the government won the first round. Then, if you look at the appeal court decision, basically what the court says is, well, we're not saying that Rwanda is unsafe. What we're saying is that somebody deported to Rwanda might then further be deported to another country that is unsafe. Well, by that definition, there is no safe country in the world, right? That's equally true of France or Italy or somewhere, right? So what they're saying is you can never repatriate any illegal immigrant. Now, I cannot read that judgment without thinking the judges were looking for an excuse. Yes. They were looking for where's a weak point that we can overturn the whole thing. So this, in the end, must be a political decision. I'm quite in favour of immigration, controlled legal immigration, but I'm much more in favour of the rule of law.
Can I just say something? That, in terms of party politics, they must get on with this straight away. Because it's all too likely that Keir Starmer will say that the Labour will rejoin the European Court of Human Rights. Very likely he'll do that, and that'll be a clangor. It will really embarrass him. They must get on with this straight away. And can I also just say on this front that I was a bit surprised by Lord Sumption's recent article about all this, because he in fact was a Remainer. That this Lord Sumption, I forget where the article was now, but he had an article, what's it? Spectator. Lord Sumption was a Remainer, but in fact he's advocating essentially because of the excesses of the European Court of Human Rights that we should leave European Court of Human Rights. And something like that, you know, that has a lot of weight. They must get on with this as soon as possible.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I feel this is one of the best meetings that the British group has ever had. And we are greatly indebted to our two speakers of great intellect, a great analysis, and are not afraid to put their points of view over. And I think today's meeting, we can take so much from it. It has been so constructive, and we owe these gentlemen a great